the Besorah Studies, Part 1. Last Tuesday evening, we read the last chapter of Devarim, that's Deuteronomy, and the first 5 verses of Bereshit, or Genesis chapter 1. So we ended the Torah cycle, and in the same evening we began a new cycle. However, during this next Torah cycle, I'm going to suggest that we focus on the first 5 books of the Brit Hadashah, the New Testament. The reason for this change is because of the times in which we are now living. I consider that we are near the return of Yeshua, and I believe it is important that we look in more detail at the Hebraic background behind the Besorah, or the good news, of Yeshua, as it's set forth in the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts. Together, these 5 scriptural narratives build a true picture of Yeshua, from his birth right through to his resurrection, and beyond into the development of the first century Messianic community. While proposing to go down that route, it is also necessary for us to keep the words of Torah firmly in front of our minds each week, because Yeshua himself reminds us in Yochanan chapter 5, verse 46 and 47, if you really believe Moshe, you would believe me, because it was about me that he wrote. But if you don't believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say? So with those wise words in mind, I want to start the deliberations this morning looking briefly at Bereshit chapter 2, and then move on to consider the background of both the birth of Yochanan, the Immerser, and Yeshua himself. In our readings this morning, we deliberately skipped over chapter 1 of Bereshit, because we all know that story very well, how God created the heavens and the earth. But of course, it has been a matter of much debate and discussion over at least the last 2 centuries. So we'll skip over that for today and look firstly at chapter 2, where we see in verse 7, it is the first time that God is actually referred to as Yahweh God. That is the wording we find in the Complete Jewish Bible. It does vary in some other English translations, but the intent is always the same. It was Yahweh God in verse 7 who formed Adam from the dust of the ground and placed him in the garden, which Yahweh God had already prepared somewhere east of Eden, and which he called in Hebrew Gan Eden. It was this first garden where all the trouble of human history began. It followed the deception of Adam and Havah that God's sovereign plan swung into action. From that point forward, God's plan for humanity has been expressed through the words of the Scriptures, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. As we see from the words of Bereshit chapter 2, the conditions in Gan Eden were perfect for Adam and Havah, and their relationship with Yahweh God was also perfect. That is, of course, until the adversary deceived Havah and subsequently Adam. Hence, the long-term outcome of that deception, as we know, of course, is that all humanity must die. And the only way of preventing mankind from gaining access to the tree of life and living forever, of course, was for them to be thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Only through the death of Yeshua, who is the second man Adam, is it possible for that death sentence that was laid upon all humanity to be reversed. However, as we see from the time Yahweh God made his edict of death for all mankind, right down until the death and resurrection of Yeshua, there was always going to be a struggle for supremacy between Yahweh and Satan, or the adversary. So let's consider Yeshua and the adversary. If we look at chapter 3, verse 15, Yahweh God set the ground rules for the outcome of Satan's future. When he was speaking about the serpent, he said, I will put animosity between you and the woman, and between your descendant and her descendant. He will bruise you in the head, and you will bruise him in the heel. Yeshua would be bruised in the heel, while the adversary himself will ultimately be bruised in the head, which means eternal destruction. Now that one edict made by Yahweh God at the beginning of human history set the stage for a constant struggle for supremacy between the adversary and Yeshua. What about the lifespan of man? Jumping forward to Bereshit chapter 6 verse 3, we read there that Yahweh said, My spirit will not live with human beings forever, for they too are flesh. Therefore their lifespan will be 120 years. Now there have been many attempts by scholars and commentators and various others to find a meaning to these words. But if we look at the English word years, we see the Hebrew word behind it is shana, which also can mean cycles of time. Because the human race had been corrupted by the sons of God coming down and taking their daughters and fathering a race which is known as the Nephilim, Yahweh God decided that it was necessary to cut short the whole period of mankind's existence, the period in which they were going to develop. There needed to be a defined period for their development. So, as we now know through the words of Revelation chapter 20 verses 1 to 3, there will be a restorative reign of Yeshua. It will be 1,000 years during which the adversary will be chained up to prevent him having any further effect on humanity. Therefore, if there is a defined restorative period, logically there must be a period of development coming before the actual restoration. As we read in Bereshit chapter 2 verse 2, on the seventh day God was finished with his work which he had made. So he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had made. God rested on the seventh day so that the creation could develop. And as Shaul said in Hebrews chapter 4, all mankind has been given an opportunity to enter into God's rest. Therefore, if the period of God's rest covers that development and restorative period, it must be a period of 7,000 years. 6,000 years of human development, followed by 1,000 years of restoration. So how does that match up with Bereshit chapter 6 verse 3? If we turn to Vayikra or Leviticus chapter 25, we see that Yahweh spoke about Yovels, or Jubilee cycles of 50 years duration. Those were time periods within each generation of Israel, during which all things were restored. Any debts were settled, and any person that was in slavery to another was actually released from bondage and given back to their own tribes. All the land went back to the tribe to which it belonged. That was what the Yovel was all about. By applying that same model on a greater scale, we can see that Creator God will restore his sovereign plan within that 7,000 year cycle. So it follows that the 120 Yovels, or that's 20 times 50 years, equals 6,000 years, which matches the time period allotted for the development of humanity. So if Bereshit 6:3 is understood as 120 Yovels, we can then expect the reign of Yeshua to follow that 6,000 years of development. All these details were only made known to mankind through the release of the book of Revelation. But now, is not time to discuss all those details. Hence, all that we need to consider in Bereshit chapter 2 and 3 is the direct link between the words of Torah and the life and times of Yeshua. So let's look at the reflection of Yeshua in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 42 verse 1 says, "Here is my servant, whom I support, my chosen one, in whom I take great pleasure. I have put my spirit in him, and he will bring justice to the Goyim." Then, in verses 8 and 9, Yahweh says, "I am Yahweh, that is my name. I yield my glory to no one else, nor my praise to any idol. See how the former predictions come true, and now new things I declare before they sprout." Here Isaiah is speaking about the earthly sojourn of Yeshua. In verse 9, Isaiah is saying that the words he has been given to Israel ahead of time, so that they could recognize Yeshua as the Mashiach when he arrives. There should be no mistake about his identity. But regrettably, as we will see over the coming weeks, the stubborn, stiff-necked attitude of Yeshua's generation confirmed just how blind they were and how similar this generation even today is in relationship to Yeshua's generation. Now, what about the gospel readings? As I said on the reading list, the gospel readings are out of sequential order to enable a better chronological flow of the overall narrative that's been considered. Now, the reason for selecting the portions from each of the four Gospels was to develop a chronologically clear narrative about the birth of, firstly, Yochanan, the Immerser, and then Yeshua as the Messiah. While all four Gospels speak about the life of Yeshua, they are four separate accounts about the same events. Individually, they do not cover the whole narrative from the birth to the death, because each gospel focuses on a number of particular aspects of Yeshua's life, but regrettably, they neglect some of the others. But when we bring these portions together from each of the gospels and rearrange them, we can see a clearer sequential pattern emerge. So looking first at Luke chapter 1, it is necessary first to consider the timing of the birth of Yochanan. In Luke chapter 1 verses 5 through 17, Luke there paints a well-detailed picture of the events that led up to the conception of Yochanan and shows the reason why he was being singled out for this special purpose before Yahweh. In verse 16, we see that the whole of his life he was to be under a Nazirite vow. He was never to drink wine or other intoxicating liquor, and he was to be filled with the Ruach HaKodesh right from his mother's womb. The reason why he was a lifelong Nazirite is explained in verses 16 through 17. He will turn many people to Israel, to Yahweh their God. He will go ahead of Yahweh in spirit and in power, and the power of Elijah, to turn the hearts of the fathers to their children, and the disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready for Yahweh a people prepared. His role in life was to become a unique Cohen or priest. Normally, at the age of 30, having come from a priestly background, he would have started his service in the temple. But instead, he's called to be a witness of the coming of Yeshua by immersing in the Yarden River. Now, looking at verse 23, we see that Zechariah, his father, was on temple service at the end of the 8th division period, and he returned home, and his wife Elisheba conceived. But because of her age and the disbelief that she could become pregnant, she remained in seclusion for a full 5 months. The actual details leading to the timing of his birth are centered around the latter part of Luke chapter 1, where we see in verses 56 to 58, Miriam stayed with Elisheva for about 3 months, and then she returned home. The time arrived for Elisheva to have her baby, and she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and relatives heard how good Yahweh had been to her, and they rejoiced with her. Now, putting all the details of Luke 1 together, it is possible to pinpoint the actual date that Yochanan was conceived, and that turns out to be on the 2nd of July, 2 BCE. That's using the Julian calendar. Then counting forward 280 days, which is the normal human gestation period, gives us a date of Yochanan's birth as being Wednesday, the 7th of April, 1 BCE. In that year, that day was the day of Pesach. Is that a coincidence, or is it the work of Yahweh? What about the birth of Yeshua? Having determined the time of the conception and birth of Yochanan, we can now move on and consider the same events in the life of Yeshua. In Luke chapter 1, verse 26 to 35, we are told about the circumstances surrounding the life of Miriam, the mother of Yeshua, when the Ruach brought about his conception. At the time he was conceived, the angel Gabriel spoke to Miriam and explained in verse 21 that she would give birth to a son, and she was to name him Yeshua, because he will save his people from their sins. Like her cousin Elisheva, Miriam was also overwhelmed by what was happening, so she sought solace by going to stay with Elisheva, as we see in verses 26 to 35. But the angel informs Miriam that her cousin Elisheva is also pregnant, and she's in her 6th month. Then in verse 39, Miriam set off to stay with her cousin. Now the important point that is brought out at this juncture is that Yochanan stirred in his mother's womb upon hearing Miriam greeting his mother. The point here is that Yochanan reacted to the presence of Yeshua, indicating that Miriam was already pregnant when Elisheva was in her 6th month. Now Elisheva confirms the life of Yeshua by saying in a loud voice, "How blessed are you among women, and how blessed is the child in your womb." From these verses, we know that by the 6th month of Elisheva's pregnancy, Miriam was also pregnant with Yeshua. So from that we can arrive at the actual date of Yeshua's birth. If we count backwards from the assumed date, which we've been discussing is the first day of Sukkot, in the year 1 BCE, the first day of Sukkot fell on the 30th of September. Therefore, counting back 280 days, we come to, surprise, surprise, the 25th of December. Is that another coincidence? Or maybe a reverse by the churches of Christendom as to what reality was? Did they turn Yeshua's conception into his birth date? We don't know. To me, it makes more sense than the usual traditional reason given for the Christian Jesus to have been born on the 25th of December, which is taught that they selected that day to replace the Roman festival of Saturnalia. But hang on, the festival of Saturnalia was not celebrated on the 25th of December, but on the 17th through the 23rd of that month, a few days earlier. So why pick the 25th of December? Was it because of the conception of Yeshua? That remains to be identified in the future. History, when established outside of Scripture, allows for all sorts of errors and distortions to develop. So let's move on and consider Jochanan's ministry. We've seen how both boys were born within a matter of months of each other, and how the two pregnancies overlapped. But now the scriptures take a quantum leap in time to the beginning of Jochanan's ministry. First, in Luke chapter 3 verse 1, we're told that Jochanan began immersing in the 15th year of Emperor Tiberius, in accordance again with the Julian calendar. That means that the 15th year began, or his 15th year began on the 18th day of September 28 CE. That timing is important because Jochanan, like Yeshua, began his ministry when he was 30 years old. So tracking back from those dates gives us the correct date for establishing when both boys were born. We can see, not like the usual traditional teaching, that they were born around about 4 or 5 BCE. The chronology shows that it was actually 1 BCE for both. As we read in Mark chapter 1 verse 4 to 8, once Jochanan established his ministry, the people began coming out to him from various parts of Yehuda and from Jerusalem, confessing their sins and being immersed in the Yarden River. We're also told that he was dressed in camel hair with a leather belt round his waist. Now that's hardly the attire of a Cohen who would normally be on duty in the temple, assisting people to immerse themselves for the ritual purification before they entered the temple courts for each of the annual festival celebrations. However, in verse 7, Jochanan begins proclaiming, "After me is coming someone more powerful than I. I'm not worthy to bend down to even untie his sandals. I have immersed you, the people, in water, but he will immerse you in the Ruach HaKodesh." He has established himself, Jochanan had established himself on the east bank of the Yarden, close to the town of Beit Anya, where many of the Jews who came from all over the diaspora on their way to Jerusalem for the 3 festivals of Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, all had to cross over the river at this point. That's why Jochanan established himself there. It was like being in Hyde Park. It was the spot to be. People had to go past, and what he was proclaiming, people were actually being immersed for forgiveness of their sins. It was there that he prepared for the immersion of Yeshua. And as we read in Matthew chapter 3, verses 13 through 17, Yeshua came down from the Galilee to the Yarden to be immersed by Jochanan. The initial dialogue between them suggests that Jochanan was aware of who Yeshua was. And of course, he says to Yeshua that he is the one that should be immersed. Jochanan should be immersed by Yeshua. But Yeshua's response is interesting when he says that we should do everything righteousness requires. It appears from these words that righteousness meant let's be compliant with Torah. Then in verses 16 and 17 we read, as soon as Yeshua had been immersed, he came up out of the water, and at that moment heaven opened. He saw the Spirit of God coming down upon him like a dove. And the voice from heaven said, "This is my Son, whom I love. I am well pleased with him." As Yeshua rose out of the waters of the Yarden, as the anointed Messiah of Israel, his ministry was ready to begin. But before he could launch into the work of his Father, he was led away into the wilderness for a necessary preparation for what lay ahead of him. When Yeshua rose from being immersed, the bat kol, the voice from heaven, was heard. At the same time, the dove descended and settled on Yeshua. Now here we have two things, the voice from heaven and the dove, both the audible and the visual. While all that were nearby heard the sound of thunder and saw the dove, they did not actually hear the words. But the bat call was certainly heard by all the angelic forces of heaven. Particularly the adversary who finally knew for certain that Yeshua was the one who would bring about his downfall. As we had considered earlier in Bereshit 3:15. The adversary had to do something drastic if he was going to keep control of the situation. Only by coercing Yeshua into relinquishing his place as God's anointed could the adversary hope to succeed. Just as the adversary had deceived Adam into rejecting the commands of God and thereby stealing control over the earth, he is now taking an opportunity to challenge Yeshua over his right to be the one chosen as the Son of God. Maybe he, Satan, could gain control over the whole of earth's affairs forever. All he had to do was to disgrace Yeshua in front of his heavenly Father. Following his time in the wilderness, Yeshua, of course, was tired and hungry, and his human nature was susceptible to the actions of the adversary. As we read in Matthew 4:2-10, 3 times Yeshua was challenged by the adversary over his right to be the chosen Son of God, the one upon whom the whole of the future of humanity would rest. As Shaul says in Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 and 2, in days gone by, God spoke in many and various ways to the fathers through the prophets. But now, in the Acharet Hayamim, he has spoken to us through his Son, to whom he has given ownership of everything, and through whom he created the universe. Now those words were about to be fulfilled in and through Yeshua. If the adversary was going to prevent the sovereign plan of God being fulfilled in heaven and on earth, he had to render Yeshua unworthy of the title of Son of God. That goal could only be achieved by coercing him into at least one act of disobedience toward his Father in heaven. So the adversary tried 3 times, challenging Yeshua, encouraging him to give up his rights of rulership of mankind. As we read in Matthew 4, the tempter said to him, "If you are the Son of God, order these stones to become bread." Knowing that Yeshua is the bread of life, and that as Yahweh, he had been the one who gave Israel the manna from heaven, what better way to deceive Yeshua than to coerce him into providing himself with food out of ordinary stones, bearing in mind that Yeshua was hungry after having spent 40 days in the wilderness. Then, in verses 5 and 6, the adversary took him to the holy city, to the temple of Jerusalem, and took him to the highest point in the front of the temple. "If you are the Son of God," he said, "jump." Then, the 3rd time, in verses 8 and 9, once more the adversary took him up to the summit of a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and all their glory, and said to him, arrogant as he was, "All this I will give to you if you will bow down and worship me." All 3 situations, Yeshua responds by throwing the challenge back at the adversary. Each time, Yeshua drew attention to the words of Tanakh. Yeshua did not defend himself in all 3 challenges. Instead, he calls upon the words already given to Moshe. By refusing to put himself above the current station as a human, Yeshua overcame the challenges of the adversary with dignity. The adversary, knowing that he was nothing more than an angel and had no option other than to leave Yeshua alone and accept the reality that Yeshua truly was the chosen Son of God. So in conclusion, Today we have started a new Torah cycle. However, as I've shown in this morning's focus, this year is going to be on the life and times of Yeshua, and latterly on the book of Acts, where we considered the development of the first century Messianic community. From our readings this morning, I hope it's clear that to understand the work of Yeshua, it is necessary also to consider the Torah of Moshe and the prophets. We can't leave them behind. We've got to bring them with us, even though we're focusing on Yeshua. The timing of the birth of Yochanan and Yeshua, as we can see, was no accident of history. Rather, it was carefully planned by Yahweh himself. As the details of the gospel narratives, and particularly Luke, leave no doubt regarding the timing of the birth of both Yochanan and Yeshua. Turning then, of course, to the immersion of Yeshua, we saw how when the Ruach HaKodesh came down upon him in the form of a dove, the important point was that the heavenly realm heard the voice of God, even though the people saw the action. And it reinforced the fact that Yeshua is the Son of God. We also saw how the adversary had been taunting Yahweh and latterly Yeshua since the time of the serpent deceiving Adam and Havah in Gan Eden. Yeshua, when he comes to be tested by the adversary, he responds not by challenging the adversary as one human being to another, but rather he calls upon the words of Moshe. The adversary's attempts to thwart the sovereign plan of God had failed again at this juncture and every one before. But he's never given up trying. And even today, he's working just as hard as he ever did to try and destroy the relationship between the true believers and Yeshua himself. So he tried yet again to discredit Yeshua before his heavenly Father. And immediately after Yeshua had been in the wilderness for 40 days. 3 times he tried, 3 times he failed, but Yeshua responded each time by reminding Satan that he must not put Yahweh, their God, to the test. Now next week we will look at the silent months between Yeshua's immersion and when he begins to spread himself out into his ministry, both in Jerusalem and in the Galilee. We'll see progressively how it gets bigger and bigger and how the challenges are constant throughout that period. So until then, Shabbat Shalom.